Good woodworking is basically about cutting and joining rectangular pieces of wood together, and accuracy is the name of the game.
That's right, Ed, and no machine's more accurate than a table saw, but it can be a little scary for a newcomer, and it can definitely be dangerous if you don't use it properly.
But don't worry, we'll tell you everything you need to know to cut accurately and safely at the table saw in just 5 minutes. Let's first talk about the type of table saw you need. Now for carpentry, just about any saw will do, but when it comes to woodworking, you're going to want a bit more.
And the first thing you should look at is the motor. You want one with about 15 amps, or 1 3/4 horsepower, like the one on this table saw. You also want a nice T-square fence that locks down at the front of the saw, but not at the back, and it's always parallel to the blade.
You're also going to want standard width miter gauge slots. They're 3/4 of an inch wide, and that'll allow you to upgrade to an aftermarket miter gauge if you so desire.
All right, that sounds great. Let's get cutting. The first two cuts we're going to cover are the most basic, rip cuts and cross cuts. You'll hear woodworkers talk about these all the time. So a rip cut, it's always with the grain of the board, cutting it to width, while a cross cut, like the name suggests, is across the grain, cutting it to length.
Let's start with rip cuts, which happen against this fence, appropriately called the rip fence.
Wow, that's clever.
As you can probably guess, this fence needs to be perfectly parallel to the blade when you lock it down into place. Otherwise, the workpiece could pinch the blade or move away from it.
Yeah, and a good fence has built-in adjustments for that. There's these little screws on it that adjust the angle and keep it parallel to the blade. Modern saws also have really good safety behind the blade, a riving knife or a splitter.
Now, you'll have to remove that blade guard at times. But be careful and remember to always leave that splitter in place. It's really important because it actually prevents the workpiece from rotating onto the back of the blade and potentially kicking back at you.
But before you make any cuts, you want to make sure that the blade is square to the table. When you do that, the square should touch the plate of the blade, not its teeth. Another important piece of safety equipment is a push stick. A lot of saws come with something like this one, but we prefer a shop-made one like this. The long length of it lets you put a lot of downward pressure as you push it through the blade.
And lastly, the board matters too. You need your board to be pretty flat, and you need one edge to be straight so it doesn't rock and roll on the saw table.
All right, let's make some sawdust. Set the rip fence, adjust the height of the blade so it's just above the board, then turn on the saw and make the cut.
Keep the board level on the table and pressed against the rip fence. Use both hands to guide it, but when the back end starts getting close to the blade, grab that push stick and finish the cut safely.
Notice how the splitter keeps the board on track.
Hey, check it out. Nice clean cut. Today's safety systems offer a low-profile riving knife that can be set below the top of the blade for cuts that don't go all the way through a board. It works great for cross cuts too. Now another great thing is to have a nice outfeed table like this one. It's a simple work table we built to just under the height of our table saw. But what about cross cuts, Matt?
Yeah, to make one of those, Ed, I'm going to need a miter gauge.
Oh, you mean one of these?
Exactly. A miter gauge comes with every table saw. It can pivot to make angled miter cuts, hence the name.
Clever.
Yeah, but most often, you keep it right at 90 degrees.
Now the one that came with your saw might not be that great, and you may want to upgrade to an aftermarket model, but here's how to make the one you have work its best. You can start by screwing on an auxiliary fence.
It's just a matter of screwing on a piece of plywood. The screws go in from the back. Check to make sure that the miter gauge is square to the blade. Using your square again, and make sure it misses the blade's teeth. And make sure that the rip fence is well out of the way. Now to make the cut, you begin by squaring up the first ends. This cut also makes a curve from the auxiliary fence, so you know exactly where the blade is cutting. The long fence not only makes it easier to hold the workpiece in place, it also pushes the offcut past the blade safely.
The auxiliary fence also supported the wood at the back of the cut, where it tends to chip out, nice and clean. But if you want to cut multiple pieces to the same length, that's where a stop block and a good clamp come into play. Nice. That lets you crank out a lot of pieces all at once.
Yeah, it sure does. Well, that's the 5-minute guide to the table saw, but it's a really versatile machine, so there's a lot more to learn and a lot more to do.
Yeah, like making a cross-cut sled for bigger work pieces, and cutting tenons with a tenoning jig, and even making angled cuts.
But now you know what to look for in a saw, how to use it safely, and how to cut your parts to the perfect size.
Thanks for watching.